Well, good afternoon, evening. Welcome to our Tuesday night Torah study. My name is Jerry Watkins. And as you know, we've been going through the Torah, kind of line by line, verse by verse. The ancient Hebrews, even during the time of Messiah, had the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, divided into 54 portions. And that way they could do a portion per week, and they had what they call the Torah Cycle. Every year they would cycle through the Torah. They began the week after the week after Sukkot, and started with Genesis 1:1, and they would go through the cycle, and at the end of a year they would be back at the next Sukkot. They would be back at the end of Deuteronomy and start all over again. That's a perfectly good cycle, and it's a lot of fun to do. We've done it many times that way, but one of the things that we found out that sometimes it's hard to cover all the material that's in a portion in one sitting. So we decided to go a little bit slower than that and just go from chapter to chapter and at whatever pace we naturally found. And with that in mind, we've started here about, I guess it must be 4 or 5 months ago at the beginning of Genesis, and we're now up to Genesis chapter 25. So that's where we are. Tonight we're going to start with Genesis chapter 25, and you'll catch on if you haven't been involved before. Before I start, let me pray. Father God, I thank you for your Torah. I thank you for how valuable it is to us today, even some 3,500 years after it was first written, that we can learn about you. We can learn about your nature and your character, and we can learn about how much you love us. We can learn about the way you'd like us to live, the things that are important to you, and therefore ought to be important to us. So I just thank you for this, and I thank you for the opportunity to be able to teach your Torah, knowing that I'm an imperfect person. I just trust that people will take what I say and with a grain of salt and decide it for themselves. Also, I really appreciate the discussions that we get into because I find that we learn from one another. You are always good about working in groups, and I just appreciate that very much and ask that you would work with us this evening, bless our conversation, and help it so that we might learn from one another and learn from you. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so one of the things I always like to do is I like to talk about review last week for just a minute. We spent almost the entire time last week on chapter 24, I guess it was. 24 in my Bible has got the heading, I believe it's Isaac and Rebekah. And chapter 24 obviously follows chapter 23, which is a short chapter which described the death of Sarah. So chapter 24 is all about how Abraham sent his chief servant, who we deduced is named Eleazar, who he's had since almost since he left Haran. He left his father to go to the promised land in the first place. Eleazar has been his chief servant, and Abraham sent Eleazar to get a wife for his son Isaac, his only son Isaac, and he sent him to his family who lived in Haran. And we talked about how at this time, there's our map here, Abraham was living in Hebron, which is kind of the middle of Israel, if you will. It's just a little bit south of Jerusalem. And Haran is way up here north of Damascus in Syria, or what was called Padan Aram back in the day, Padan Aram. So Eleazar went back up to Haran and got a wife for Isaac and brought her back to Isaac in Beersheba. And the whole chapter can be considered an allegory of how God has dealt with his people during the course of history. And if we looked at that allegory just a little bit, where Abraham plays the part of God, and Eleazar plays the part of the Holy Spirit, if you will, and Isaac is the only son of the father, and the bride would be us. And so it's a very interesting allegory. It's interesting to look at, to think about. And I found that one of the most fascinating things was the way chapter 24 ended. The way chapter 24 ended, I'll read the last two verses. Verse 66 of chapter 24 says, "Then the servant," in this case Eleazar, "told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her, Rebekah, into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." So I just thought that was a fascinating little verse, because Isaac being comforted after his mother's death relates back to the previous chapter when Sarah died, and it would imply that Isaac had some difficulty dealing with his mother's death. Anyway, we had a good time. And then, based on the large crowd we have, are there any comments about that chapter? Has anybody thought about it in the past week and have any comments that they'd like to make? And so he waited for an appropriate length of time. And they said, okay, now we'll move on to chapter 25. Chapter 25, the heading in my particular Bible says, "The Death of Abraham." So there's some interesting things in here, but let's read this for a little bit and see what we can find out. Chapter 25 begins, "Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Leumites. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldaah. All these were the descendants of Keturah." Verse 5, "Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. Altogether, Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. And there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who lived near Beer Lahai Roi." So there's really all kinds of things to talk about in this little bitty chapter here. So one thing was, who was Keturah? Well, it's widely held, maybe that might be too strong a statement, but there's certainly Jewish scholars who believe Keturah was really Hagar, and that after Sarah died, Abraham went back and was reunited with Hagar. That's a little bit doubtful, although it certainly could be the case. In any case, if it was Hagar then was able to bear him another 12 sons. I guess that's 12. Let me count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, 6 sons. Okay? And that seems like they might be stretching the timeline a little bit, but who knows? There's this the comment about, and then it talks about some of the who these sons were and their sons, just so you can kind of get an idea of the lineage. So I went and looked it up and to see if there were any references to these sons of Keturah in the rest of the Torah, or the rest of the Bible for that matter. And the only son that's mentioned is Midian. All the rest of them, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak and Shua, are not mentioned anywhere except, well, they're mentioned here, and they're mentioned in Chronicles, which lists the genealogy as well. But they're nothing new. So this is the only mention of them. I don't know if anybody has any other information about any of them. Midian is the one that's talked about in other places. Does anybody, let's see, I can't do this hardly without asking questions. Does anybody remember what reference or what's important about Keturah and Abraham's son Midian? Midian, it turns out, was, Jethro, who later becomes Moses' father-in-law, was known as a priest of Midian. So that's the mention of him, and we'll talk about the Midianites and various different things. So this all refers to this guy here, this son of Keturah and Abraham. Verse 5 says, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. Now, Isaac was special in a lot of ways, right? God made it very, very clear. Well, Isaac was the only son of Sarah, and Sarah was, in spite of what other concubines he might have had, Sarah was his wife. And his relationship with Sarah was different than it was with certainly Hagar, and you could argue perhaps Keturah. And God made it real clear that Isaac was the inheritor of God's blessing. It wasn't these later sons, it was Isaac. So Abraham, it says in verse 5, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land to the east. So if all of this was taking place, around Hebron and Beersheba, right in this area, the land to the east is clearly this way, right? And if we had a larger map, the Arabian Peninsula, dips way far south down here. The very south end of the Arabian Peninsula has got Yemen and places like that on it. And then to the very south and then a little bit east is the Ethiopia. Anyway, it says right here on this map, it says Midian. So he evidently sent one of his sons with Keturah down to Midian. And it mentions, does it mention some of these others in here? But I've seen maps that mention some of the names. It would appear that let me start again. You can find maps that list some of these names, and most of them tend to be in the southern Arabian Peninsula. So one can deduce that Abraham gave them wealth, of which he had plenty at this time, and he sent them south and east, and they ended up settling in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, verse 7. Altogether, Abraham lived 175 years. And then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. He was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. And there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah after Abraham's death. God blessed his son Isaac, who lived near Beer-lahai-roi. Several things to talk about. How old was Abraham when he died? 175, right? Hi, John. You can get the microphone if you want to.
Jerry, I've got a question.
Sure. But now you don't have to. Go ahead.
Keturah, whenever that name pops up there, if that was Hagar, why in the next chapter do they bring her name back?
It's a good question. As a matter of fact, that would, if you ask me, that'd be an argument as against
right.
Why it's Hagar. This argument that it was Hagar is, I don't know how prevalent that is, really. I'm just not sure. But to me, it's not even hinted at.
And how old was Sarah when she died?
137.
137. That's interesting because whenever she laughed at the angel or whoever was talking about her having a baby, she said she was, advanced in years and she lived another almost 40 years or 30, whatever it was.
Yeah. She had, I believe Sarah had Isaac when she was 90. So we can go back and check that out, but I'm pretty sure she had Isaac when she was 90.
And then one last thing, and I'll shut up.
Sarah was
25.6.
127 when she did.
Okay.
Go ahead.
25.6. Something that stood out at me, sons of his concubines.
Yes.
Multiple.
Multiple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Me too. Me too. So one of the things I wanted to talk about for just a second, verse 8 says, "Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people." I just think that's an interesting turn of phrase. First of all, an old man and full of years, died at a good old age. I mean, it's not like let's see. As I get older, one naturally begins to think of stuff like this, but a good old age is something, I don't know, probably past 60 anyway, which makes me eligible as any time now. An old man and full of years would seem like, well, you know, he's had a good life, done what he wanted to do from God's standpoint. He has done what God had wanted him to do, and he's doesn't have any more mountains he particularly wants to climb, or his bucket list is rather short, if you will. Full of years, and he was gathered to his people. I think that's the phrase that's really kind of nice, gathered to his people, which would indicate that, to me anyway, it indicates it's kind of an afterlife involved in all this. Were you going to say that? Or?
Ditto.
Ditto. Okay, fine. Thanks, John. I just wanted to camp on that for just a second. So who buried Abraham? It says right here, who buried him? Verse 9, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael. It doesn't talk about the sons of the concubines, but in the previous verses, it said Abraham, while he was still living, he gave gifts to his sons and his concubines and sent them away. So that doesn't mean they couldn't have come back for the funeral, given that their mom had bothered to text them that the event had occurred and they needed to jump on the nearest plane so they could get back. But it says his sons, and it mentions who they are, Isaac and Ishmael. Now this is the first obvious incidence of the fact that Isaac and Ishmael had kept a relationship even after Sarah had, I don't want to say forced, but had encouraged Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham did that because God told him to. Abraham, if you remember right, you can go back and find it, but Sarah was upset at the thought that Ishmael may want or take part of the inheritance that was intended for Isaac. And so she demanded of Abraham, take the slave girl and her son and send them away. Abraham was, if you'll remember right, not too excited about this idea. But God came to him and says, you should listen to your wife and do what she says. So he did. And so Hagar went away, and there's that story associated with that. But you remember where they ended up was over basically, it was over here somewhere. She went back toward Egypt because Hagar was Egyptian. So they kind of headed back this way, but they didn't get very far. And one of the places where they had stopped before was this place called Beer Lahai Roi. Beer is well. Lahai Roi. I don't remember exactly what it means, but anyway, it's where Hagar ended up settling with her son. Roy, see, it could be. It's the God who sees me. Well of the God who sees me. Thank you. That's what that is. Anyway, so notice in verse 11 here, it says, after Abraham's death, beg your pardon? 25. This is chapter 25, verse 11. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. So it would appear, and I think we made mention of this one time earlier, that Isaac was probably living near Ishmael. I mean, Ishmael was his older brother, and they grew up together for a fair amount of time. So, and Isaac was probably looking for family, if you will. And so I think that it's fair to assume that Ishmael and Isaac had a relationship of one kind or another, and here's a little piece of proof to that effect. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. Okay, so verse 9, his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in a cave of Machpelah near Mamre. We remember all that story. That should bring back all that story of how after Sarah died, Abraham went to wherever it was, the cave near Mamre, and he bought it from Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite. You remember there was a chapter associated with him asking to buy the land, and Ephron saying, no, I'll just give it to you, and Abraham saying, no, I don't want you to give it to me. I want to buy it. I'll pay you whatever you ask for it. So he says, well, it's 400 shekels of silver, but, what's that among friends? Well, we looked at the fact that 400 shekels of silver is probably a lot of money, probably more than the place was worth. But Abraham wanted to buy it, and it's the first legal recording of a title deed transaction in the Bible, and there's no reason to believe it's not still in force. Anyway, death of Abraham. So if you got anything you want to add about the death of Abraham, go ahead.
So one of his bucket lists was to figure out where to put his bucket.
Yeah, go. Mm-hmm. Well, good. Let's go on then, verse 12. This is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael listed in the order of their birth. Nabaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Yatur, Naphish, and Kadima. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Altogether, Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the border of Egypt, as you go toward Ashur, and they lived in hostility toward all their brothers. So, again, Havilah and Shur is thought to be over in here. And so it says that altogether, it's verse 17, altogether Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. But it doesn't say where he was buried. So there's no reason to think that he was buried in the family tomb in Hebron. Somewhere he's buried out in here. And then it lists all these 12 sons of Ishmael. And some of those sons are listed on this map here. Kedar was one of them. Duma, I think, was one of them. Yep, Duma, that's the city here. Do we have any of the others? Tema, Tadmor. Well, anyway, there are other maps that have some of these names. Again, the idea being that Ishmael's descendants settled in the southern end of Israel, southern end of Canaan, and probably northern Arabia, probably. It says, mine, this translation is different than some. Mine says, verse 18, his descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the border of Egypt. So Shur would be over in here somewhere. As you go toward Ashur, and Ashur is up this way, and they all lived in hostility, and they lived in hostility toward all their brothers. Does anybody else have anything in this? I think there's some question about whether or not that ought to be translated in hostility, but that would be consistent with the prophecy that God uttered over Ishmael whenever he was born. Yes.
Do we know how old Hagar was when she died?
Hagar, we don't. No.
We don't.
No, we don't know that. We don't know that.
And when it says Ishmael went to be with his ancestors, do we know who that was? Was that Abraham?
It's a good question. In the fact that it uses the same language, it says, he breathed his last and he was gathered to his people. What other people could it have been? when you think about it. I mean, his dad was Abraham.
Right, and everything followed the dad.
Yeah.
I mean, just because Hagar was
Egyptian.
didn't matter.
No.
Yeah, I would have thought it would. His ancestors would have been Abraham. I
Yeah.
would have thought, but maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not what they mean.
Well, now, I don't know. I can't speak with any degree of knowledge on Islam, but I know that this is a very important event to them because the Muslims believe that it's Ishmael that is the legitimate and adoptive or preemptive son of Abraham, and they consider themselves.
But at this point in time, Islam's not even thought of,
Absolutely
and
not.
so this has got to be Abraham.
Yeah.
In my opinion, but I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know that.
No. That's one of the things that kind of gets me about any of these upstart religions, the newer ones, is that you don't know who, they don't take into consideration the vast amount of time that's gone on here. Yes.
Yeah, just like, but it says that Abraham left everything to Isaac
Yes.
while he was still living, and he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines.
Yes.
Multiple women?
Well, that's one of the points. It mentions Keturah, right, up in the
Yeah.
previous. That would, well, it says, although it says he married another wife. So, yeah, multiple concubines. It's number one. Would you consider Keturah a concubine?
No.
It says it's a wife. Okay. So did he have other concubines? I suppose so. We don't know of any. I mean, that doesn't mean he didn't have them, but we don't
But
know
that's
of
what
any
he says over here, that he gave gifts
to his other
to his
sons.
sons of
Yeah.
concubines, but it
Yeah.
doesn't mention only Satura.
Yeah. Yeah. Hagar.
Or maybe it was Hagar.
Yeah, maybe it was just Hagar.
Satura.
Certainly, that's the only thing that's supported by Scripture. We'd also look at that word concubines and see whether the plural is really an appropriate translation there. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It wouldn't call her a wife. I mean, he could have two wives because his first one died.
Yes, that's true. Well, but
I
it says
assume,
wife.
I assume that's after Sarah.
Yes, absolutely.
So
it's
she
after
could be a real wife
Sarah.
and not a concubine.
Yeah, that's right. So it's to me, this whole thing is you need to look at it from the translator's point of view and make sure they did the right thing, because Abraham, from what we know of his life, was not the kind of guy that had concubines, right? I mean, he had to get pushed to sleep with Hagar in the first place. So my own personal feeling, without looking at it any farther, would be I would look at that word concubines and see if it was the one that's commonly used, or whether there might be something that goes on there. I don't know. Good question, though.
If the translation's right and it is concubines,
Yep.
we have no idea how many kids he had or how many sons.
Yep. And they did, it's interesting to me, because they did go to a lot of trouble to talk about the sons that Keturah bore to him. And yet the only one that's mentioned any after this is Midian. Midian's the only one of the sons of Keturah that we ever hear about again. All the rest of these guys we never hear about again. Doesn't mean they didn't exist. I'm just saying. Yeah. Don't know. This won't be the last one we don't know, huh? John.
So in verse 5, the Abrahamic covenant, the trust established in Genesis 15, has been, I would argue, transferred to the new trustee, Isaac.
Yep.
So that's not a trivial verse there.
Not at all. Not at all. And not only that, but we'll come across a verse here in the not too distant, this evening probably, which confirms that was God's plan also. God confirms his commitment, his contract, his covenant that he made with Abram on Isaac. He says, you're now the recipient. You're now the trustee, if you will. Okay, I think we'll move on. Verse 19, Jacob and Esau says, "This is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to Yahweh on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Yahweh answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled within her, and she replied, 'Why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of Yahweh. And Yahweh said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger.' When the time came for their womb, the first came out was red, and his whole body was garment. So they named him Esau, which means red. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob or Yaakov. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them." So let's stop there and talk about that just for a little bit. So it says Isaac was 60 when he became the father of these twins. Do you remember how old he was when he married Rebekah? Did I get this wrong? Are you looking at some, John? 40, I'm sorry. Verse 20. 40. I said the wrong word. Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. Okay, and then verse 26, Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth. Okay, so how long was Rebekah barren? 20 years, right? She must have been 20 years.
So Jacob was gone from them for 20 years or so?
Well, Jacob didn't exist.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I know. I'm reading ahead, but I'm reading to a pattern that
Oh, all
I'm
right.
just thinking out loud here.
Okay.
Was he gone for 20 years when he left
Oh, he might have been.
at Laban's
Yep,
place?
that was about 20 years. That's about 20 years. So what do you think about this? Well, first of all, it's interesting. I've always found it interesting, the phraseology in verses 21 and 22. Isaac prayed to Yahweh on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Yahweh answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled within her, and she said, "Why has this happened to me?" So she went to inquire of Yahweh. So, the reason this is interesting to me is because it sent me in a thing here. What do you suppose Rebekah's relationship with God was? I mean, it says that Isaac prayed on behalf of Rebekah. Do you suppose Rebekah prayed? Yeah.
Well, it's a patriarchy, so why isn't it's reasonable that he would pray? My question is, did it take him 20 years to get around to pray for it?
Yeah, there's no reason to think that that's the case, because you know good and well that Abraham and Isaac have been praying for offspring for a lot longer than that. And God didn't see fit to grant them their prayer until it was his timing. So
what's the use of praying then? I'm just being a little bit cynical.
Well, that's okay.
You have a question?
Well, it sent me off a little different direction than that. It was basically, Rebekah grew up in the household of Bethuel and Haran. Sorry, what was the other? Nahor, Bethuel, and her brother Laban. And we know that they were idolaters. We know that they must have been somewhat aware of the God of, at this point, Abraham, because they knew of their brother, Abraham, or brother/uncle, who had gone off where God told him to go and created for himself a family and achieve some wealth and all this kind of stuff. We know that they knew of Abraham, but they clearly didn't have a relationship with God the same way that Abraham did. So I guess my point is it would naturally be that Isaac goes to God and says, please bless me, my wife is barren, we'd like to conceive, whatever. But it's not at all clear that Rebekah would have fallen right into that same mold. She doesn't, that's not the environment she came from, right?
We don't have any record of any supernatural things happening in their lives during this period either, do we?
No. Well, now we got Isaac. I've often thought that, Isaac's experience with Abraham at Mount Moriah when he was almost sacrificed has got to have left some sort of an impression on him.
No, I agree. But my point is, when they got together for that 20 years, we don't know of any miraculous things happening.
Nope.
So that may have affected her walk.
Yeah. Well, my only point with all of that was to say that she was probably coming around to this whole knowledge of what it meant to have a relationship with God. Plus, she probably didn't have a clue about this covenant thing, And so, beg your pardon? Yeah. So it's natural that it would be, not only because it's his responsibility, but it's natural it would be Isaac that went to God with this. Yes.
I don't know if I'm jumping up a little bit, but he says also that she heard from God when
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
he said 2 nations. And what does that mean? One in the flesh and the other one in the spirit?
What? It certainly could mean that, as Paul would say some thousands of years later.
Say that again?
Paul implies that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Marvin.
We're living in a time after Yeshua, so we have a complete, we weren't around back then, but she wasn't around when everything was going on with Abraham.
Nope.
And so we look at it through a certain rose-colored glasses, but I can understand, she grew up as a, worship. I don't want to say she was worshiping other gods, but her family did.
Yep.
Whether she did or not, who knows?
Yep.
So a personal relationship, I'm not sure.
She wouldn't even know what it is.
No.
Yeah,
no,
I agree.
She wouldn't. I mean, she's along for the ride. She's married her cousin.
Yep.
And they've got this. I don't want to say weird religion, but they got this different take on the Godhead.
Yep.
But if there hasn't been any, I don't know. I don't think she knew a lot about it.
Oh, I agree. That was my whole
that's
point
my
in saying
point.
that. Yeah, is that she didn't have any framework or basis for an understanding of God, to say nothing of this covenant that her husband inherited, right?
So why are we blaming her for not praying effectively?
I'm not blaming her. I'm just saying by the way this thing is worded.
You're assuming that Isaac was going full ahead, praying every day. I think Isaac is spiritually not. I mean, despite the obvious event that happened out at Mount Moriah, he's not the brightest spiritual person of the patriarchs.
No, I agree with that.
Because who does he pick when it comes to between Esau and Jacob?
Yeah. No, I'm not arguing that either. I'm just saying that the wording of this little passage makes me realize that Isaac's relationship with God is going to be much different than hers, because she hasn't had one, and she hasn't been around Abraham her whole life to understand what this might mean. That's all I'm trying to say.
Another question might be, why isn't there a recording of Isaac receiving a dream?
Receiving what?
A dream about something of importance.
Well, she's the one that went to him and says, "Why is this happening to me? Why are these kids beating each other up in my womb?" Isaac didn't care. Hey, that's your problem. Right?
Well, if if he's the one who received he's the next in line for the patriarch.
He ought to care.
He was the second. Well, who's the next one? It ought to be something on his mind.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Okay, so she does. I mean, she's obviously concerned about this. I mean, again, what's fun to me to do is to put yourself in the position as these guys, these people, these characters sometimes. So she's new to the family, new to this whole God thing. She's pregnant. This is obviously her first pregnancy. And mine's verse 22 says, the baby's jostled within her. And she says, why is this happening to me? Right? And so she went to inquire of Yahweh, and he said, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So this is a prophecy that's been looked at for a long time. Yeah.
Well, I don't think God is real active in Jacob's life at all.
Oh, absolutely not.
And I think he's desperate by this time. Dad prayed a lot, or he talked to God, so maybe I'll try that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say that he was notified that the prayer was answered. He found out about it when she was pregnant.
Yeah.
I mean, and he doesn't know if his prayer worked or it just happened.
That's a very good point. As a matter of fact, whenever she comes to him and tells him about her dream, he might go, "Wow, that's pretty cool."
Right.
Didn't happen to me.
But to me, God doesn't get active in this family again. I mean, he did this, of course, but until his son comes along and leaves home. Mm-hmm. But anyhow.
Yeah, Isaac doesn't appear to play a very pivotal role. Yeah.
If I was Rebecca and I got that prayer, I'd go, well, gee, that's nice, but can we get back to the World War I that's going on in my womb here? I mean, what does that got to do with me and my immediate needs?
Yep, that's a good point. Of course, those verses are for us. These verses are the verses that were passed around the campfire when this story was told from generation to generation 4,000 years ago.
Right, and this is what she bases her actions.
Yeah. Yes, she does.
On this thing.
Yes, she does. That's a good point. So when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys. The first to come out was hairy, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau, which means hairy. I might have screwed that up the first time I said that, but it means hairy. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, and he was given the name Jacob. And Isaac was 60 when Rebekah gave birth. So the question I always like to ask is, were they fraternal or identical twins? You know the difference between fraternal and identical? They were fraternal twins. They weren't identical because one was hairy and the other one wasn't, right? So Isaac was 60 when Jacob gave birth. Okay, we'll go on. I'm going to come back. We're going to do some math here in a bit. So they'd been childless for 20 years. Now it goes on to say, the boys grew up, verse 27, the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So this gets into a question of favoritism, So this parental favoritism has always been one that's kind of, most of us who were not only children have had to deal with this at one time or another. Like what Tommy Smothers always said, mother always loved you best, kind of a deal. It's favoritism, parental favoritism happens. It's interesting if you just look at this. We'll do this kind of periodically as we go through the story. But favoritism is not necessarily in and of itself wrong. It doesn't say that Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau. more than Jacob, or and hated Jacob, or anything like that. And Rebekah loved Jacob. It doesn't say she loved Jacob more than Esau. So I guess my point is I don't want to go too far with this, but one of the things that I've had to learn to deal with, parents are allowed to have favorites. What they shouldn't do is make those real obvious to the children themselves. But, favoritism happens. And the only reason I say that is because God has favorites, right? He's fair. Just because he seems to love some people more than me doesn't mean he doesn't love me. And my job is not to sit there and judge him or compare about that. It's to be happy with what I got.
So we're kind of using two different terms for love.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah.
Because
Favoritism.
like we like to say in the Hebrew roots movement, if you love God, keep my commandments, is what Yeshua says. Right? So it's not an emotional thing.
No.
It's primarily hey, do this, do what your old man told you to do.
Yeah.
Do what God tells you to do. So is this just an emotional? It kind of comes across like it's just an emotional. I like him because he's doing it's not tied to any spiritual thing. He fills my belly, and I like what he
Yeah.
So
it's favoritism.
That's what I was gonna say. Sometimes you can get along better with one child.
Yeah.
Or they have a better character.
Yeah.
And you feel more at ease
Yeah.
with any person who is easygoing as opposed to someone who is explosive or
Sure.
right.
Sure. That's fair. That's fair.
And,
As a matter of fact, I think maybe a better translation would have been, rather than loved, would be Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, favored Esau, but Rebekah favored Jacob. That's what I would say, is favored and not loved. But anyway, I wanted to point that out just because that comes across a lot. We'll see this again, and it's an excuse for many, many sins. Yes.
So where is it that he says he was describing the character?
Skillful hunter, verse 27.
No, Jacob.
A man of tents.
A man of tents.
Yep, that's verse 27 also. Jacob was a quiet man staying among the tents.
So the sages say, according to Nehemiah Gordon, that he was a man of the Torah. He stayed at home and he read the Torah and the Talmud. Well, I mean, not the Talmud.
Maybe. Like he had all that. Right.
And so, but that's what the sages say. Nehemiah says, the guy's a shepherd.
Yeah.
He's out in the fields and he's got to take his tent with him, and that's what his job was.
Mm-hmm.
That's how he brought something into the family, whereas Esau is relying on his hunting skills and going in to get wild animals.
Yep. The verse 28. What's verse 28 say in yours? Yeah, it's love. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think, we can't change it. So I guess love is love.
Yeah.
But to me, with my kids, I can relate to one better than the other.
Yeah.
But I love them both.
Yeah. That was my point. Though one of the things, I tell you, this is kind of fun. It's a little bit of a cop-out. But, we think in English. We're speaking in English. The word love in English means a lot of different things. It really does. And they had just one word for it here in Hebrew. But there are many different kinds and many different aspects to it that don't get adequately translated in many times. And that's part of the insufficiency of language itself. Because, again, I would say that the word favored makes more sense. But they didn't have a word for favored, I guess, or they didn't have one they liked. They chose love. So that's okay.
maybe this is not a big deal, but it's explained why Isaac loves Esau, but Rebecca just says, "Well, I love Jacob," presumably because of the dream.
Well, that's a
Well, I mean,
pretty
there's a qualified reason why Isaac loves Esau. He does something for him.
okay.
But Rebecca loves Jacob. I'm assuming, it's reasonable to assume.
Well, all right. I don't know how reasonable that is, but I'll give you that.
You just think it was a natural instinct that he loved.
You know, maybe
personalities
she loved Jacob because Isaac loved Esau. Somebody needed to love the poor guy.
I also think that she loved him because he stayed with her at home all day.
There you go. There, yeah,
They
it
spend
could
more
very
time
well be.
together and-
Yeah, well, I
and-
think that makes a lot of sense because Esau's all the time running off out there with his bow and arrow shooting stuff, and he stays home and
With
cleans
more
the
homing-
sheep poop.
More things in common.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he looks like Yosemite Sam was what I'm guessing. Esau. He's hard to love that.
Yeah, that's good. It looks like Yosemite Sam, the guy with the red hair. Yeah. Let me go on. Verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is also called Edom, which means red. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good's the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. Thus Esau despised his birthright. This is a fun story. We'll spend some time on this one. So you can see the situation going on there, right? Jacob's just hanging around. I mean, on the face of it, it looks like this. Jacob's hanging around, minding his own business, cooking some stew, right? Which a guy, I guess, hanging around the tents would every now and then do.
Well, do they?
Well,
Because, isn't that what his mother does?
well,
Takes care of that?
I was going to say maybe he was doing it to please his mother or something. Maybe, I don't know.
Or maybe he liked to cook.
Okay, well, there's even a third possible reason that we're going to come up with. Esau came in from the open country, presumably having been out there for quite a while hunting for wild game, famished. And he said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished," which is why he's also called Edom. Well, okay, fine. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." Well, that's a weird thing to say, don't you think? I mean, his brother comes in all sweaty and panting and everything and says, "Man, I'm about to die of starvation here. Let me have some of that stew. It smells pretty good."
You'd have got the same result if he had come to his brother and said, "Go give me some stew." And
Yeah.
he could have said, "Well, I'll do it, but you got to give me your birthright."
Yeah.
He didn't have to cook it. I think him cooking it is a big deal.
Okay, that's fair. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Go ahead, John.
So the background story in Jasher
Yeah.
is, I think, if I'm going off memory, it's they're at the funeral of Abraham.
Okay, we're going to talk about that.
Oh, okay.
Why don't you wait for a minute, because I do want to bring all of that up. But let's go ahead with just a plain story.
Okay.
Okay. He comes in and he says, Jacob says, "Okay, first sell me your birthright." Which, if I were Esau, I'd go, "Man, where'd that come from? I come in here telling your stew smells pretty good and I want some, and you want me to sell you my birthright? I mean, what does that say about Jacob?"
Well, it doesn't make sense unless you want to fill in the background. But whatever the case is, what does it say about Esau, who says, "What's it to me? If I was him, I'd knock him in the teeth and just take his stew." I mean, if you felt so passionately about the birthright,
Yeah.
the importance of it, you'd be passionate about keeping it.
Well, but obviously Esau doesn't.
That's
He does.
yeah. It's funny that the Bible jumps in and adds commentary and says he despised his birthright by his actions.
Yeah. Well,
So-
yeah.
I agree. It's kind of cool. It's weird why Jacob is asking that,
Well,
but
Okay.
I think it's because he senses that he doesn't really care about the birthright. Jacob realized the importance of that, and at least more than Esau does,
Yeah, well,
and he wants to step up to the plate.
No, I think that's the key. I think that Jacob has been sitting around thinking about how undeserving Esau is of this birthright. He doesn't even know what it is. He doesn't value the thing, whereas I'd really like to have it. I think it's kind of important. It's a pretty big deal to me, Jacob says. And so he says, sell me your birthright. And he, like you say, I don't care, fine. Go ahead.
Sounded like he was already premeditating. What do you
mean?
He was
Just
thinking
there,
about it.
obsessing about it. Yeah,
finally had a plot with
Yep.
his mother.
Yep.
And carry out the plan.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said for that.
Premeditated plan.
Yeah. So anyway, old Esau basically says, fine, I'm about to starve to death anyway, why do I care? Fine, let's do it. So he makes an oath and sells it to him.
Let's go back. I think that was a good point just made, that
Yeah,
that his mother is filling his head.
with how important this is.
Yeah, and whether Jacob really understands, it's his mother acting out through her son.
Yeah, that makes good sense.
I think that's what you just said.
That makes good sense. Yep. Okay.
While he was sitting around in a tent with his mother, his reason she liked him so well, because he was more her personality.
Yeah.
She probably had been telling him this story ever since he was a little kid.
Yeah.
And this may not have been the first time he tried to get the birthright.
It could be. That could very well be.
You don't know.
He certainly valued it, because he wouldn't have asked this question if he didn't. Yeah.
And plus, Jacob, it said the elder would serve the younger. So that was a fulfillment of the prophecy.
Yes, it was. Now, there's a question as to whether or not, whether they were trying to fulfill the prophecy or not. We don't know, but that's certainly a fulfillment of it for sure. Before we go on to the backstory here, let me propose at least a part of it. One of the things that, let's see. Before I do one final thing, all that was required here was for Jacob to say to Esau, "Swear to me first." And so Esau says, "Okay, I swear you can. I'm selling you my birthright for this bowl of stew." And so Jacob gave him some bread and stew, and he ate it and got him left. Yes.
So I have in my notes here, a legally binding contract between the parties, Jacob and Esau. The necessary elements of a binding contract are offer, that was the stew, the acceptance, or the offer was,
Stew for the
give me your
birthright.
birthright, give it to me. The acceptance was, what good is it to me? The consideration is
Stew.
this very good tasting stew.
Yeah.
And then the terms and conditions are, well, I guess we'll read about that. That he's now the office holder, the responsible for
He
one.
has the birthright.
Right. And and there was a meeting of the minds. There wasn't a. They all understood what was going on.
Yep.
There was no
Yep.
funny business.
Yep.
I'll take a little different tack. It may not have been a binding contract because there's real estate involved. When Abraham bought the burial plot, it was in front of a bunch of witnesses. There's no witnesses here.
I was going to say there's no witness.
And if it was a binding contract, the deal's done, and you wouldn't have the issue whenever Abraham's dying, not Abraham, Jacob, blesses
Isaac, you mean?
Isaac,
Yeah.
and he thinks he's blessing
Yeah.
Esau.
Yeah. Yep. But that's all right. That's
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Now that I think it through a little bit, because this was the great sin of Jacob, that he did not. He had an awesome claim to being the birthright, but he doesn't make it.
yeah.
I'm reading ahead. And he just goes ahead, listens to his crazy scheme his mom comes up with,
Yeah.
and has no regard. He denies not Esau the birthright. He denies him his due process to making a claim to his birthright. The witness would be, so Jacob, or Esau, did you do this?
Yeah.
What's he going to say? No, he's going to lie to his old man or something, or he's going to lie when especially the Bible says, I don't know how you quote the Bible back then, but
Yeah.
that's part of due process. If there's someone challenges your contract, you need to be able to defend it.
Yeah. Yeah, this would be pretty hard. It's a classic he said, she said kind of a deal, except they're both he's. Let me go on and point out my one little thing, and then we'll talk about the apocryphal backstory. One of the stories that goes along with this is that one of the reasons that Jacob was cooking the stew was because this was a special red stew that was done at funerals. And this event happened when Abraham died. This was the special red stew that was the funeral stew to be served at Abraham's funeral. That's an assumption that's being made, okay?
Well, is there any? I never heard that particular part. Is there
Well-
anything backing that up, or
Well-
I mean, do Jews today?
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether there is
Okay.
or not. But anyway, the reason that's important is because if this did occur shortly after Abraham's death, we know that Abraham died when he was 175 years old, right? Okay. So if he died when he was 175 years old, let's see, I got to kind of go back and work this through because the math is there, but you have to get it just right. We know that, let's see. Yes. Abraham, let's see. Isaac was 60 when Rebekah gave birth to the twins, right? Okay. When Isaac was 60, Abraham was 160, right? Because Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Okay? So if Abraham was 160 when the twins were born, and he dies at 175, that's 15 years. So how old does that make Esau and Jacob?
15.
15 years. And this, to me, is the kind of behavior you'd see out of 15-year-old guys. They wouldn't be smart enough to know that the birthright is worth something, at least on Esau's part. And Jacob would be probably helping his mom make the lentil stew for Abraham's funeral. So, all circumstantial, and it all supports this idea of this event occurring at the death of Abraham, which is where you started what you were going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Esau despised his birthright and sold it for a bowl of soup.
Yes.
Just because
Just
he was hungry.
just like a 15-year-old would do.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm starving to death here.
What good's it going to do me
Yeah,
now?
what good's it going to do me? I'll be dead if I don't get something to eat. Go ahead.
So we're saying they're old. They're beyond bar mitzvah, if that meant anything back then. They're
Okay.
2 years past that, but they're still teenagers, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going ahead, but
That's all right.
it's. I guess when does the event happen where they have Isaac is on his deathbed and that whole story.
Yes.
Is there an age? Do you know how many years has passed?
It doesn't really say, but it's obviously after this one. There's only one little story to talk about before we get there. We get there in another chapter. But anyway, there's a lot of detail in here that all needs to be explored a little bit.
Gary, let me ask you a question. On the death of Abraham, and the kids are about 17 years old.
15, but go ahead.
Right, 15, whatever. They're teenagers. Why would he be out hunting at that point in time if his grandfather just died?
Well, could be, I'm just making this up, but it could be he was out hunting and he heard. He was on the trip when he heard his grandfather died. Don't know.
Yeah.
Could be. Isn't that kind of the story?
This is the part I was going to say.
Okay.
Jacob was mad at Esau because he was like indifferent. Like, oh, whatever. I don't need to. There's some great fishing going on over here. We got to get the fish while the fishing's good.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah.
he was mad at Jacob. Jacob was mad at Esau that he was late for the funeral.
Ah.
because
Okay.
he was off doing something else.
Okay. Yeah. I would say all of this is built on pretty thin ice because there's nothing that says this was related to the funeral of Abraham at all, right? So, but it could be. Anyway, I thought your term, John, was very useful when about the end of verse 34, where it says, "Thus Esau despised his birthright," because that is kind of the Bible commentating on itself, making a commentary on itself.
Yeah, that doesn't happen. I can't think of it very many times where that happens. Where
Because you read
the
the
narrator
story.
jumps in and says, "Let me help you out here. What's going on?"
Yeah. You read the story, and the story seems a little bit weird with old Jacob saying, "Sell me your birthright," and all that. But then whenever you get that conclusion, "Thus Esau despised his birthright," that's telling you this is the conclusion you're supposed to draw from this story. Yeah. Well, you know what that's like? That's sometimes, do you ever remember hearing Aesop's fables when you were in elementary school? Aesop's fable? Yeah, Aesop's fables. Like the
I didn't hear them.
tortoise and the hare and the ant and the grasshopper. You never heard those?
Yeah, I don't know. It was Esau. Esau's table?
No, Aesop.
Oh.
Aeosop.
Yeah, I don't know who it was.
Aesop fable. They're not biblical. They're obviously, but the point I'm trying to make, you know about the tortoise and the hare. You know about the ant and the grasshopper. You know the grasshopper sitting there playing the fiddle while the ant's busy industriously working. So when the winter comes, the grasshopper's freezing to death. The ant's got all this food in his hole, and the grasshopper says, "Give me some food." And the ant says, So the moral of the story is, work while you have a chance and be industrious, blah, blah, blah. It's like that here. It's like the moral of this story is Esau despised his birthright. This is how he despised his birthright. He was willing to sell it for a bowl of stew. And that's the thing we're supposed to get out of it. And yeah, the Bible just flat tells us that. That's interesting. Yeah.
It is really interesting because you've really got two things here. You've got the spiritual birthright, and that's what you're talking about, and you've got the physical birthright of all the assets.
Yep.
And he didn't care. He didn't care about either one of them.
Yep. Well, yep. I tell you what we're going to have to do going forward, and this is going to be the subject for the next discussion next week as well, is that there are two things involved. This is the birthright, okay? The other thing is called the blessing. The blessing and the birthright, and the two things together determine the future head of the family, if you will. Those two things were together for Abraham, and they were together for Isaac, and we're going to find out that they get separated down the line here. But this was half of what Jacob valued. Jacob wanted the birthright and the blessing, and he went about trying to get them both. He succeeded legally, if you will, with the birthright, but he didn't do so good with the blessing. Go ahead.
How does that pertain to us now?
No, that's a good question.
Like, are we willing to sell our birthright for a temporal thing?
Yeah.
Taking this story now to our time.
Yeah. Well, there's some good questions there. See, let me think about that for a minute. The birthright, this is my assumption, and I could be wrong. The birthright is that thing where back then, during this time, if a man had a family and he died, let's say he had 3 sons. If he had 3 sons, his estate would be divided into 4 pieces, and the eldest son would have 2 of the 4, and each of the other 2 sons would have 1. So it's called the double portion, or it's called the birthright. The birthright and the double portion, I think, are the same thing. The blessing comes from God, and that's something we're going to talk about separately. But so what the birthright, again, to me consists of is primarily material possessions. But it also goes along with it the responsibility for being the head of the family now. So he gets to call the shots. He gets to, in some sense, lord it over his brothers because he's the guy that runs the family. And he gets twice the inheritance for doing that. That's my understanding.
But is it for us as well, like salvation, our birthright, and our I don't know. I'm not applying it.
No, I know what you're saying, but let me go on to say that as we look from here on out in the Bible, It's hard. It's more the exception that the rule, that the eldest actually got this. God always messed things, I shouldn't say God messed things up. Things always occurred so that what should happen, the eldest get the birthright, almost never does. Like it didn't happen with Jacob's sons. Who ended up with the birthright in Jacob's son's case? I think it was Judah myself. But it goes on, and you'll find that it's seldom the first one that actually gets it. So, I don't know. I don't know exactly what we're supposed to learn from it, really.
Like in my life, I think it's like we are called to be the firstborn.
Yes.
So I apply such a matter, like not losing our rights as a first children of God.
I buy that. I think certainly from a spiritual standpoint, given that we are the firstborn of Him, yes, we have I'll buy that. Yes. We have the birthright. Yeah, yep, I agree with that.
So a couple of things. You could have argued that Esau deserved the birthright, and it was, as we've said before in the past, it's his to lose.
It's his to lose. He was first.
Right.
Yeah.
And he did. And just that same thing happened to Reuben and Simeon and Levi.
Yep.
So you have to defend. If you think you have the birthright, you better learn how to defend it and not just have somebody come along and scam you out of getting rid of it.
Which is what happened here.
Right.
You better value it.
You better shomer, like guard the garden.
Yep.
So you need the shomer, guard, keep, and hold.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's what we're supposed to get out of it.
Well, the other thing too is, so the guy who gets the birthright, you don't just casually give that to somebody. It's got to be someone who's responsible and someone who will perform that which is written down, the trust that he's been entrusted with.
Yep.
What are the terms and conditions? What does the Father before me want me to do according to His instruction? Ultimately, it goes back to Yehovah.
Yep.
What does He want me to do? To do that, you have to be a student of this.
Yep.
And you have to take this seriously.
Boy, that's a good point.
So the indication is Esau didn't. Now, the parallel also of today is, what is the church? The church is like Esau. And this is better to talk about this in the future, later on.
A little later, but go ahead.
But the church is like Esau. I don't need to do that Jewish stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Those terms and conditions.
Yeah.
They've convinced themselves that the law has been done away with. But boy, we deserve the blessings. Of course.
Yes.
Come on.
Yeah.
Obviously. We're the church.
Yep. I agree with that. I think that's a good way to look at it.
I think as far as Esau is concerned, he wasn't real concerned about the worldly blessing, no, not blessing, worldly assets that he was going to get with this, his two pieces
Yeah.
to the other one. I think he didn't want the responsibility of dealing with all that crap. He wanted to go hunting, and he didn't care.
Yep.
And I think, and as far as the blessings are concerned with us, we can't take that attitude.
Nope.
We have to care.
Yep.
And we have to do something.
Well, I tell you, it's the same old story in that, I'm sure he didn't mind.
And don't mind fulfilling the responsibility.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I'm sure he didn't mind the money or the material assets associated with a double portion. But the truth of the matter is he totally dismissed the idea of having extra responsibility. He didn't want that at all, and he wasn't going to do it.
He was entitled to it just because he was firstborn.
That's right. That's right. He didn't need to. Well, and that's a very common thing. We'll find that all throughout the Bible. So anyway, I knew we'd have fun with that just because it's kind of an interesting story.
You can take that in today's terms, and I'm sure if you go to some of these ultra wealthy families that have multiple kids and multiple sons, there's a lot of time the firstborn doesn't want anything to do with it.
Yep.
And they won't do it.
Yep.
And so it has to be, the business or whatever it is has to be passed on.
Yep. Oh yeah. And there's a lot of messing around that goes on. Yep. Those kind of things the family usually, I don't know. They oftentimes have severe struggles. Yeah. Good. I like that. So anyway, we've gotten at this point in time where we've established the fact that Jacob values the birthright enough to take it, And Esau doesn't value it enough to care. Ward.
I just wanted to mention if anybody wanted to get the backstory on what you were just talking about.
Yeah,
to look
okay.
at Jasher chapter 7, 9, and 27.
Okay, thanks.
That's a lot of fill-in on that story. It's
Yep.
very interesting.
Okay, yep. Jasher, the book of Jasher is, considered non-canonical, but that's fine. To the extent that you can read that and get some backstory that doesn't conflict with the rest of Scripture, that's always a good thing. A lot of times it fills in details that are kind of nice to know. Want to move on? Chapter 26. We won't be able to get completely through the chapter because it's a little bit long, but I want to read some of it and we can get started, and then we can come back to it and finish it next week. So chapter 26, it says, Now there was a famine in the land, besides the earlier famine of Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Just so you know, let's see, we got Gerar over here somewhere. Maybe it was, oops, sorry. Well, I thought we had it there, but it doesn't look like we do. Anyway, I'll just kind of tell you where it is. Here's Gaza. Gerar is over in here somewhere. It's it's to the east of Beersheba and Hebron. I'm sorry, to the west. It's nearer the coast. It's where the Philistines lived. That's what it says in the Philistines. Chapter 26. Now there was a famine in the land besides the earlier famine of Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Yahweh appeared to Isaac and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in the land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me, kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. We ought to stop there for just a minute, just for a couple of things. First of all, another famine comes up. It's even careful to say different than the famine that came up in Abraham's time. Isaac went to the king of the Philistines in Gerar and says, Yahweh had appeared to Isaac and said, don't go to Egypt. Now you remember what happened when the famine came along in Abraham's time. He went to Egypt. It appears that God did not come to Abraham and say that. It also, we talked at the time about there's no record of Abraham having gone to God to say, should I go to Egypt or not? But in this case, Yahweh comes to Isaac and says, don't go to Egypt, right? He says, just stay here for a while. I'll take care of you, he says. And then he reiterates the covenant, the blessing that he gave to Abraham. He says, I'll be with you and I'll bless you. For to you and your descendants I'll give all these lands, and I'll confirm the oath I swore to Abraham. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and give them all these lands, and through your new offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Now that's pretty much verbatim what he told Abraham, not once but 3 times. Yep, go ahead.
So this complements this complements what the last verse of the previous chapter said.
Yes.
Because Esau despised his birthright, I'm choosing Isaac
Yes.
to be the one who's going to. We're confirming.
No. Isaac is.
I'm sorry, Jacob. He's confirming the. Oh, you're right. This is just talking about Isaac, isn't it?
Yeah. This is just
Never
Isaac.
mind.
Okay, that's okay.
Never mind.
Never mind.
So, Jerry, this is, as far as we know, this is the second time his encounter with God. Once was being at the barbecue, that he wasn't the main deal.
Yeah.
And the other, and now this.
Yeah, this is the second.
Because he appeared to, he talked to Rebecca. He didn't talk to Isaac, did he?
No, he spoke to Rebecca about
Right. So this is, as far as we know, this is his second encounter with God up close and personal.
That's right. Isaac's a real cryptic character in terms of, he seems committed and into it, but he doesn't seem very active somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same complaint against Abraham when there was a famine. Why don't you go to, it doesn't say that he went to God and said, hey, what's the deal here?
Yeah.
And it's causing God to react to what Isaac is doing instead of Isaac going and petitioning Jehovah.
Yeah. What should I do?
Yeah, and he's worried that he's going to keep going and go to the instinctive place that they go to, which is Egypt.
Egypt. Yeah.
They don't get the things resolved here, I guess.
Yeah. 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 That's one way of looking at it. But anyway, so God comes to Isaac and reconfirms his original covenant with Abraham and says that you're the new trustee. You're the guy, right?
Well, that's what I meant. We talked about that earlier, where he gave all the land.
Yep.
He gave gifts to the concubine. Abraham gave gifts to his concubines, but everything else he gave to Isaac, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's
this.
In complementing this.
Yes, that's exactly right. But I thought it was interesting. God says all that. He says, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you, which is an important point. Verse 5 says, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. Okay? So this, to me, is always kind of it took me a while to really understand this, but this was God telling Abraham, this is how I want you to behave. This is what I want you to do. These are the things that you should value. This is the way you should conduct yourself. This is the way you should approach me. He was basically telling Abraham how to live out the Torah. That's my opinion. And he says, the reason I'm doing this for you is because Abraham did that for me. He obeyed all my commands and my decrees. Go ahead.
The blessings of the Father is passed down.
Yeah.
But well, what I find strange about that, not strange, but popped out at me this time, is the fact that he didn't tell him because you've kept all my commandments.
No, it's because Abraham did.
Right. So probably Isaac is not keeping all the commandments like he's supposed to.
That's exactly right. And then further tests are coming. But anyway, verse 6 is the end of it there. He says, so Isaac stayed in Gerar. Well, good for Isaac, right? Because that's what God told him to do. Stay in Gerar. Stay here. I'll take care of you. You won't starve. Don't go to Egypt. That was the upshot of all of that. Verse 7 says, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, she's my sister. Because he was afraid to say, she is my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she's beautiful. Now, how many times have we been here?
Is Yogi Berra writing this or what?
This is the third time that a patriarch has introduced his wife as his sister, right? Now, Abraham did it twice, and the first time was when they went to Egypt the first time, and he got his wife taken from him because they assumed that it was a sister, and they went and paid him all kinds of stuff to take his wife, and she went into the Pharaoh's household, and lo and behold, everybody got sick, or they had boils or something. Anyway, they were able to deduce that it was the presence of Sarah that did this, and God protected Abraham and Sarah, sent her away, the whole people got evicted from Egypt, along with all the wealth that Pharaoh had given them, and they left. They went back. He did it again later. Who'd he do it with? He did it with the same guy, Abimelech. And that's one of the reasons why this Abimelech thing, Abimelech, however you want to say it, Abimelech means father king. So Abimelech might be a title and not a name. So, because it's doubtful, although possible, that this Abimelech is the same exact guy that had the agreement with Abraham. The reason I say it's doubtful is, number one, the age involved, and then number two, he doesn't really act like he's already made a commitment with his father. So this Abimelech acts, well, we'll get there, but it doesn't seem like it's the same guy. But it's the third time that a patriarch has introduced his wife as his sister. And you know, I was sitting there thinking about this afternoon. There's something going on here. There's a reason this story is in here 3 times. And I can't figure it out. So I think we ought to noodle on this a while and see if we can understand why there's 3 separate times in just the lives of the first 2 patriarchs that they introduce their wife as their sister. And this one has similar kinds of results, but we'll talk about it.
What does that effectively say when you say my covenant wife? She's my sister.
Yeah.
You've diminished the legal status that your wife is.
Well, that's true.
Right?
That's
You're not
true.
saying this is my covenant wife. You're bringing up this, at least this is just kind of a flat out lie. You can't even fudge that. Well, I guess you could say he's his cousin, right?
Well, yeah, you can't say, yeah, well, she's really my wife and my sister. No, he can't do that.
Right. So he's not even going, he doesn't even have a
He's
fallback.
He's got no reason to do it that I can figure.
Plus, God just said, don't go anywhere. I'm
Yeah.
chill. I'm here.
Yeah, I don't understand why he did it, other than the fact that his dad did it twice and got away with it. I mean, I don't know.
Well, it just goes to show you that Isaac isn't the brightest spiritual bulb in the
tree.
tree on the Christmas tree.
But like we talked about with Abraham, maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe, these guys are wanderers in the, I don't want to say in the desert, but they're not putting down roots and staying there.
Nope. Yep.
And there's all these other tribes and cities around, and they're probably not very safe sometimes.
Yep.
And that may be just a standard way to protect her
It could be.
to some extent, but it backfires on them quite a bit
It's-
too.
yeah.
But
Yep.
yeah, I don't know, but it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. So your assignment for next week is to think on this and see if you can figure out some good reason why this particular thing happens 3 times.
I just
the
want
Bible.
to. So we know Jacob has a habit of, I don't like conflict. I want where's the easiest
Yeah.
way out?
Yeah, confrontation avoidance.
Yes, he doesn't think long term. He thinks now.
Yeah.
Same thing. What happens later when you find out about how to get the double portion, the blessing. But
Yeah.
he's getting that from his father, I guess. His
I
father
get it.
Isaac, who's like, I heard my father do that. Well, maybe I'll try that. I don't know. I don't want to have conflict here. He disqualifies the protection that Yehovah is supposed to place over them by increasing the increasing the value he placed on Abimelech,
Yeah.
treating him fairly.
Yeah, it could be. Well, I'll read a little bit more, and then we'll call it a night and come back and finish this next week. Verse 7 again. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought, the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she's beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelech says, "What is this that you have done to us? One of the men might have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who molests this man's wife, or this man or his wife, shall surely be put to death." I think I'll quit there.
It's either the same guy or the story's been told.
Yeah. I hate to think that, but it could be. Yeah.
Because if it was passed down to the next king,
Yeah.
he lived through the other one and he
Yeah.
knew what happened.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's why
the fact that the king is so afraid of what might have happened, yeah, you know good and well that generally speaking, they didn't think that. Yeah.
Well, the famous phrase of FDR, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." I don't really like that, because you do have fear, the fear of God.
Yeah.
If you have that, everything else is secondary. He doesn't show that here. He shows the fear of
Man.
the other.
Yep.
But he also discounts the fear that Abimelech has towards God.
Yeah.
He may not like to deal with God. He might think, I can put things past people, and because they're never going to call me out on what does God say about this.
Yeah.
So we don't give credit to that either. When we cave in and we just say, well, I'm going to do it because it's easy. I'm going to let my physical fears overwhelm my spiritual defense I should have.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. This really is a pretty good place to stop because it feels like we're kind of in the middle of it, but I'd like to go home and think about it some more myself. So why don't I talk you guys into going home and thinking some more on it? Any last comments? Okay, let me pray. Well, Father God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the stuff we're getting out of it. The stuff, that's a bad thing. Thank you for the wisdom we're getting out of it. Thank you for the training. Help us to just think about this particular situation and, just work in our hearts so that we might kind of get some insight. And just bless us as we go through this week until we get together next week and we can read about the rest of this story and the things that happen in Jacob's life, Jacob being the main focus of the book of Genesis. Thanks for your Torah, Father God. In Yeshua's name, amen. Thanks very much for coming, and we'll see you.
Thank you, Jerry.